you'll notice from my bio that, I've had a bit of a windy path, if you will, from a career perspective. And I think a lot of that was intentional. And so you'll notice, I guess one thing that I'm going to try to share is sometimes breath is not a bad thing to take just in order to really figure out what you want to do before you really decide to dive deep into something, right? So for me, that's been a 20-year career path to really discover what I really uniquely want to do, and some of the rules that I've set for myself. So I'll hopefully be able to walk you through that next. So as Darren introduced, right, my name's Naresh Tana, and here currently in North Carolina, but I'll show you again, even through my educational journey, it's kind of taken me all over multiple states and countries. So, I grew up in New Jersey where I was born and raised, and I went to a small school called Bernard's High School. We had about 105 students in my class. A really good program, and New Jersey, if many of you are from there, really known for its public school. So I was really fortunate to go to a good school system and really had some inspirational teachers and able to develop my love for, I would say, biology and math amongst all the other classes. Those are the two that really kind of stuck out, and I think that was an early sign that at least I kind of had an idea of which direction I wanted to go to, if not necessarily knowing what career I should do. And like most Asian or Indian kids, right, your parents were like, you should be a doctor. So I said, sure, I will try to be a doctor. I don't think I wanted to be a doctor, but at least it was a direction to go. But I think for me, I guess I realized right on that, yes, I could go the pre-med route, but then I kind of have to be a doctor, right? Or I could do something a little bit different and study engineering. And I noticed a lot of medical schools were also accepting engineers, right? It's a kind of a common path. It's also a very common path into law school, business school. So engineers make up kind of like the bulk, usually 20-30% of those types of applications. So I'd kind of done that earlier research and realized, maybe I should do biomedical engineering. At least it kind of leaves many different doors open, because what if I don't want to be a doctor, right? So again, that was the first decision to say, hey, let me chase something that gives me breadth of options versus diving in deep too early, right? Because I think that's a common issue we see, even with, I would say, a lot of physician friends that I have. They kind of took this path early on, and I don't know if they're necessarily that content, even later on in life where they're very successful, right? So I think it's really important early on to really give yourself a chance to decide not what you necessarily want to do, but understand what things you don't want to do, right? Through that process of elimination, I think you kind of start honing on what you're going to dedicate the majority of your life to, right? So I don't think you need to make that decision when you're, let's say, 18 years old, right? I think you have much longer, right? Most people are going to work into their 60s. Let's say you have so much time to decide. Why make that decision early on and then not be too happy about it? So anyway, so I did the engineering program, which was fantastic, right? It was grueling. I quickly did a lot of lab work in biomedical engineering. I realized I don't like to work in the lab. I don't like to spend a lot of time kind of diving in deep alone into things. So for me, the PhD route wasn't necessarily a good route to go to. Many of my friends that went down the biomedical engineering route and, became both, either professors or went into research, and they're absolutely content doing it, but it just wasn't the right path for me. So, I think I ended up actually staying an extra year because I had done engineering, and I'm like, all right, I haven't really done anything to kind of work the other side of my brain, which was, liberal arts, I would say, which were always pretty important to me, but not something I really got to study in college. So I actually stayed a fifth year, almost finished engineering. I kind of dropped my last credit, which was an elective, just so I wouldn't graduate. And I ended up doing a double major in political science in that kind of year and a half. So I just crammed as many credits as I could through that summer, taking 6 classes a semester and literally just hunkered down. I was fortunate to get into this program called the Eagleton Institute of Politics. I think I was the first engineer to get accepted in that, because again, engineers weren't really looking at doing things in politics, but I had applied to this internship program the summer going into my 5th year, which was called the Washington Leadership Program, and it was an opportunity for South Asian kids at that time to kind of work for a congressman. So that really kind of inspired my love. I went to Capitol Hill. I worked for Congressman Frank Pullen. I'll show you that next. And it kind of just like blew my mind, right? I was like, wow, there's all these things I can do to make an impact, even in healthcare, but not necessarily have to treat a patient, let's say, right, on a one-by-one basis. So that even made me more confused. And I'm a senior in college by then, right? I've studied engineering. I didn't want to work in a lab. I was like, okay, wow, politics is pretty cool. And I can actually do policy and do kind of cool things and really still make an impact in healthcare, right? But more for the masses, right? So that kind of theme started catching on. Like, what can I do to really help people in the masses? I think for me, that was very impactful. I also really enjoyed working with people and presenting and working with society and, kind of doing the more social aspects of driving agendas and visions forward, right? So the scientists and everyone else could do the great work, right? So obviously, I did that and I was like, all right, maybe I should be a lawyer because everyone on Capitol Hill is a lawyer. So I took my LSAT and I bombed it. I mean, like beyond an F, right? Like I was just the worst thing I've ever done in my life. Like, all right, this isn't going to work out. And meanwhile, I was still studying for my MCAT, doing pretty well because I was still a path, right? That's all I knew since I was a kid, right? I should still try being a doctor. I decided not to take my MCAT. And I said, you know what? Maybe none of these are the options. And let me just continue doing this Capitol Hill thing. So I'll show you in a bit. I ended up working for Rutgers some more and then kind of understood what my career path should be a little bit later. Fast forward, I had gone into consulting, like in a bit. I then ended up deciding, all right, I need to maybe go to business school. That really was where my mind was crafting in, right? I started understanding you can make a lot of impact to the masses through commercial enterprise, right? And being a leader in a company that's dealing with millions of people many times, right? So I went to business school. I was close to 28 at that time, right? So I think if you're going to ever consider the business school path, I know there are schools who accept students right even after 2 years of work experience. I highly recommend waiting 4 or 5 years so you understand even in business what you like to do, what you're good at, and finding the right business school for you, right? I was working, you saw in my bio, in Puerto Rico and Brazil, and I was pretty much an expat for about 5 years working in pharmaceuticals kind of around the world. So I had no interest in coming back to the US. I really wanted to go work in Switzerland where there's a big biotech pharma sector, or go to Singapore. And so I applied to ESA, IESC, as you see up here, which is one of the top ranked 2-year programs outside of the US. It was spun out through Harvard Business School. And again, the class demographic, out of 80 kids, we had about 50 countries represented, right? So everyone's from all around the world and doing different things in cool business context. And it's a case method versus like what I did in engineering, which is very didactic, right? The Socratic method. So I really like the case method because there's really no lectures, right? You basically are the class. Everyone reads a case, right? Which is like a 20-page paper, if you will. And it's a topic and everyone debates it for 3 hours. And that literally is your curriculum, which is really representative of what business is like or what society is like, right? You really have to bring your perspective and be able to defend it. So anyway, the case method was fantastic. This was in 2010. I'm ready to graduate in 2009. And if you guys remember, we had the big financial crisis back then, right? So I had also gotten engaged. My wife's a psychologist, so we had to come back to the US. I'm like, oh crap, what do I do? So I took the exchange program at Tuck at Dartmouth to come back here for a semester and do my recruiting here in New Hampshire. The nice thing is on the exchange program, nobody wants to go to New Hampshire that lives in Barcelona, right? It's kind of like the opposite. People want to go to like Columbia, NYU, Berkeley, right? All the cool American cities. So there's like no competition to go to Tuck. And, for you guys know that are Americans, Dartmouth Tuck's like a really top school. But being in a Spanish school, there's zero interest, right? So this was kind of like a loophole I kind of found, as a good student, but as an average student, I had an opportunity to go to one of the top schools in the US to kind of fill the slots that they have. So I went to Tuck and I did my recruiting there and ended up getting the job during the crisis in Boston. So I'll tell you about that next. But this was kind of my academic journey, right? So you can kind of see, again, it's international, multiple states, cities, different degrees. And it's, I would never change my path at all academically because I think through this path, I decided what I liked and I didn't like. And I'm very content with my career today, right? And what I enjoy. I really was able to hone into my strengths through this education experience, right? So really recommend that. It's a very long one, right? I finished school when I was 31, right? And again, as you guys know, it's a lifelong learning journey, right? So you're still learning at work, you're constantly reading, so never really ends, right? But these are the formal credentials, if you will. All right, so career journey, as I kind of hinted a little bit here, but career journey, and I call out even some of the smaller jobs I had because all of it builds on everything, right? So again, everything you do and anytime you work, it really helps define who you are as a person later. So while I was making this deck, I even thought back, like, what was the first real job that I had? I worked at like a dry cleaner, for example, 14, or worked at a convenience store, things like that. But I worked at this store called Nobody Beats the Whiz, which was like a sales position selling electronics. Right? The store went out of business many years, but it was big in the New York, New Jersey area back in like the 90s, 2000s or whatever. And it was like a sales commission based job. And where I was selling like computers when computers were just getting big and digital cameras before they were really out. And this job was great because I was in maybe 10th or 11th grade, right, in high school. And I was working with all adults, right? You had to learn how to talk to people. It really taught me how to really listen to people, talk to people, convince someone. So a lot of these persuasion skills that really come out of your shell, if you will, were developed at this job, right? You can see right immediately after that, 2 years later, I got that job with Congressman Pallone, as I mentioned, was a congressman in New Jersey. He's still serving in New Jersey District 6, I think. But that was a fantastic job because I got to really represent my district and I got into the whole policy aspect and understanding that there was more than just healthcare at a one-on-one individual level, right? So I kind of helped with some of the technology policy, healthcare policy stuff that he was working on. And a lot of that is, a lot of writing, a lot of talking to people, so setting up meetings, right? Working a lot and getting paid almost nothing, right? That's kind of government work, but it's very meaningful and rewarding. So, I highly recommend if anyone has the opportunity to go even intern for a congressman, do it. It's absolutely amazing, and you really connect with the history, of the country and kind of how decision making happens. So, that was a great experience. And then, as I mentioned, when I'd come back to my 5th year at Rutgers, I decided to go into Rutgers federal relations, which is kind of like the lobbying arm of almost every university has one. And you're basically lobbying for like federal grants to bring back money to your school for, for professors, grants, NIH. You can imagine there's all this money that comes from the federal government into any research university, as well as any private university, right? So that's actually a cool aspect of healthcare too, that I realized, like, without the money, these professors can't do their research, right? So really trying to help them bring money back, which was very impactful. So, I think these 3 experiences, I kind of tie them together because it really taught me how to learn like people and dynamics, right? Which are so important on everything I do today, even. But it really started with selling digital cameras and building on it, right? And ultimately, you're helping the same professors who were helping me with their grants. So, that all happened in 4 years. So I'm very fortunate to have been able to kind of do that early on and meet some great mentors I still keep in touch with today. So after that, I would say the Clarkston Consulting this is a local Durham-based management consulting company, and I worked at Trinity after business school. These are your typical, strategy, operation consulting companies where, it's a grind, right? You're working, 80, 100 hours sometimes weekly, right? Just trying to work for multiple clients, 3, 4 different types of businesses, and you're dealing with some senior people and you're asked to fix these, white page type problems, right? Like, how do we figure out how to move our supply from this country to another country? And, there's no right or wrong answer. You just have to kind of use analysis, data, and interviewing people and figuring things out, looking at the market, see how others are doing it. You're kind of that problem solver, if you will. And so that really taught me how to build my analysis muscle, if you will, right? Which is every problem can be achieved, it can be solved through any unique solution, right? It's really up to the person to kind of bring that thought process forward. There's never a right or wrong way to do most things. And you just kind of have to figure it out, right? And convince someone that that's a good way that you did it, right? So to me, that was important because I'm taking the people skills and then more of the analytical muscle, right? You're kind of taught how to do math, you're kind of taught how to do science, but how do you apply it, right? To a practical problem. So I thought that was a very formative part of my life. I worked at Clarkston for 4 years before business school, after Rutgers, right? And then I worked at Trinity for 2 years after business school through Tuck, right? I met this company through Tuck, a few Tuck founders and Harvard founders that were there. So they're still a big consulting company today, focused on healthcare companies. And then I'd say the next phase then, right? Even when I went to business school, for me, it was ultimately always about how do I help the most amount of people, right? And that was that early theme that I had discovered. And so for me, it was either you do it through policy or you go head up a company, start a company, or do a big company, right? Help millions and billions of people. That's kind of the goal. If you can do that, that really got me up in the morning. It got me excited, right? Versus the one-on-one lab work, which I know for my co-founders at my company today gets them excited. So everyone's different. There's no right or wrong way. You just have to find what inspires you, motivates you, and really like what's going to make you get up at 4:45 in the morning and doesn't feel like work, right? That's kind of like the $1 million question. And kind of have to figure that out. I did it through trial and error. Maybe there's a better way to do it. I certainly didn't listen to my parents, right, and became a doctor at all. And I think they're still proud of me. So it works out, right? I think you just have to take your own risk and see what the best path is for you. So in that commercial enterprise, right, I worked at Eli Lilly now. That's the biggest pharma company in the world today because of all the diabetes and weight loss drugs that they're doing. But initially, they were launching a cancer division. So I kind of came in early there and helped them launch a great product. And I'll show you later on, Lartruvo for soft tissue sarcoma, which is like a pediatric cancer. So it was really rewarding. I really got that experience of meeting patients, advocacy groups, listening to them, helping develop drugs that like added life to people's lives, right? So that to me was very meaningful. And again, that's something that still gets me super excited and happy to go to work. Went to Celgene next. Since Celgene, it's been bought out by Bristol Myers, and it was probably the biggest, fastest growth company ever to exist in hematology oncology. And, we had about 12 drugs in like 10 years, right? And it was just a behemoth of a company. One CEO came over, he was a leader at the company and took off about 3/4 of the market cap of the company, right? So imagine this was like a darling of Wall Street company and just destroyed it based on just a few bad decisions. That's all it was. And it was not investing in your core competency, doing things you were good at and trying to do new things to grow the company, right? So that really taught me a lesson on how you should stick to what you're good at, which is kind of the theme of this presentation as well, and not trying to do too many things outside of your capability zone, at least when you're a mature company or mature in your career, right? I think early on you should take those risks. But Celgene was a fantastic company. And I still work there. My boss today was a Celgene colleague. So you build these connections to these companies, and everyone kind of still stays in touch and takes care of one another, right? That way. Went to AbbVie after that in Chicago. Worked on another cancer drug there. Amgen as well. I'll show you an example of one of my favorite achievements, which is there recently. Launched a lung cancer drug there that's currently standard of care. And then took a big risk, right? So Lilly, Celgene, AbbVie, Amgen, these are all big, S&P 500, like Fortune 500 companies, right? Low risk profile, right? Ultimately, my goal was, hey, one day I should start a biotech company, right? And I think that's, after a while, you kind of get bored doing the same thing, right? At least you see from my career, I want to do different things and try new things. And these big companies, that's kind of hard to move. They're kind of set, right? You're a cog in the wheel. It's really good in the beginning of your career because you learn a lot. They're really good at what they do. But then ultimately, then you kind of want to leave a market and do something else. So that's kind of the phase I'm entering now, which is why I went to Precision, like super high risk company doing gene editing, right? Something that's probably going to be big 5 to 10 years from now, right? And we may make it or may not even make it, right? You might even go bankrupt trying to chase that. So that's kind of the risk profile that I'm in now. But again, that gets me very excited because we can do something so different in the world and really help many, many patients and even cure diseases for permanently, right? So that's kind of where I am for my career journey. Just wanted to kind of lay that out for you, from learning people, building analysis, and then really applying that through enterprise, right? So I think one question was, what are some of the significant impacts that you think you've made? And so for me, I've always, tried to coin myself as like a serial drug launcher, right? Trying to kind of be funny there, but it kind of is true, because my favorite thing is like this race to the finish line that happens when a drug is kind of in phase 3, right? And you're kind of like 2 years from maybe getting approved, maybe not. If the drug fails its trial, drugs off the market. I mean, there's nothing you do. You kind of move on to the next product, and why I moved around a lot. But these are some of the drugs that have kind of brought to market. One's Lartruvo, that was that soft tissue sarcoma drug. At Lilly, for me, this was excellent because Lilly was concerned more with like lung cancer and bigger diseases, if you will, right? Because for a big company, it doesn't always make sense to chase a small market because there's no commercial incentive for them, which is sad, right? But I had convinced the management of Lilly to really invest in this drug because we were doubling the life of some of these kids and young adults that had sarcoma. So I was able to get the CFO to fund it, and really took it through management, taught the whole company about sarcoma, which no one knew, had all the top doctors kind of teach Lilly that this is important. And you can kind of see, I actually ended up naming the drug. This whole thing was kind of like a pet project that, I dedicated like 2 years to and really drove forward. We ended up getting it approved onto the market. And it was quite the success for the first 2 years that it was out there. You can see Revlimid. Revlimid's like one of the biggest drugs that's ever existed for multiple myeloma. It's a standard of care for all different diseases of myeloma as well as lymphoma and other blood cancers. So that was one of the drugs that Celgene had. That drug kind of made Celgene, right? It was just such a big product in the market. So I ended up launching the first line, which was the biggest indication for it. So that was a great opportunity. Venclexta, this is another one at AbbVie, again, for AML. For those of you know about leukemia, you see, when you see the patients of kids that don't have hair, right, and that are kind of really sickly, that's AML. It's one of the worst cancers anyone can ever get. And so we actually ended up launching this drug for Venclexta, and it's adding almost 2 years of life to some of these patients that are getting it. So again, it got me really excited for something that was a huge unmet need in the market and just able to kind of help out in the masses, right? And then just recently, Lumakras, which was the Amgen drug for lung cancer. This was a target that was called KRAS G12. So it's a mutation that everyone thought was undruggable. It's described as like the Death Star, right? Like no one could ever drug it. If you had a KRAS mutation, it was kind of a sentence to death right away. So the scientists at Amgen tried for about 20 years and just were able to kind of figure out through different like chemical approaches on how to kind of get the active form of the molecule or the mutation to open up enough to kind of drug it, right, and to inhibit it. So I worked on the commercial marketing side and really kind of brought this drug to life. So you can even see from the name Luma, which is bring light, right, from the root there, and KRAS is the crass. So the whole idea was to bring light to this mutation because no one had any therapeutic options before, right? So I can get into that one day, but just naming drugs is a science of its own, right? Because it's just very complicated. I'm trying to have errors. And then the last thing here, which we have no drugs yet, this is the gene editing company I'm working at now. This is, to me, is the most exciting because it's like a one and done approach, right? You really can go into the human genome and correct any mutations, repair genes, potentially even eliminate genes and take faulty genes out and replace them. So there's a lot of potential here. We're just starting to, as an industry, enter clinical studies in humans, right? So we were in non-human primates now. So you'll start hearing about gene editing a lot even next year onwards for a long time, hopefully, right? So there's an opportunity to, cure many, many patients there, and I'll show you that in a bit. In terms of my current position and what I do, so this is one of those positions that's really hard to describe. So it's the chief of staff to the CEO. Essentially, what a chief of staff is like a Swiss Army knife. Okay, that's the best way to describe it. Depending on what's needed, you pull out the right tool, right? And so you're doing all kinds of different things, which you can't really do chief of staff as an entry-level job because you kind of have to have some experience in all different functions, right? So as you can see through consulting, all my careers, all of that, I've kind of done a little bit of everything. So this was a great job to kind of do the same, but at a high executive level, really help the CEO as well as the senior leadership team drive like projects through, et cetera. So you can kind of see here on the green on the left, right? You're really kind of like a VP or a chief operating officer level working through the company. Sorry, that's someone who's there. You really have to be able to operate independently, right? You don't really have a team. You are like a one-man team kind of driving things through. So that's a good thing and bad thing. The bad thing is you don't have a direct team under you, but you have a lot of informal influence. So kind of everyone's on your team because you have a direct mandate through the CEO to get stuff done. So no one's going to say no to me, right? Because they know the CEO is asking me to do it. So that means indirectly they're being asked to do it. But you still have to be able to kind of persuade people, right? And kind of have that informal influence. So again, going back to learning people and that early skill set, I apply that every day. Like the managing people and through the organization is like the number one thing I do. It's not about the math, the science, any of that. That was much more important earlier on, at least in the analytical component. But now it's just all about how do you move people to do things passionately, to stay inspired, to have the same amount of energy you do, right? And that should have a multiplier effect in the company. So everyone's on the same ship, if you will. So yeah, I'm the strategic owner of like tons of different initiatives. I work with the board. I'll work with our CEO a lot, really trying to make sure the message of the company is externally being held. So like last week, for example, I was in New York all week at all the big banks talking to investors and really trying to help raise money for our next round, right? Because we need to, unfortunately, as a biotech company, we have no revenues, right? No one buys anything, sometimes for 10 years. So you need to borrow a lot of money and sell a lot of stock in order to just keep the science experiments going, right? So this goes back to all the Rutgers federal relations job. It's the same exact thing, right? But now instead of talking to government agencies, you're talking to banks, right? It's the same idea. You're selling a piece of your company little by little to keep the money coming in, just so our scientists can continue to advance our two lead programs. We have a program for hepatitis B, which 300 million people in the world have it. There's no cure. So if we can even get that to a cure by cutting out the virus's genome, which is what we're trying to do, we're going to take that into humans next year, right? This is a huge opportunity. So it's the largest liver-based killer in the world, right now, for liver cancer, all of that. So anyway, that's a huge opportunity, something that gets me really inspired. And then we're also looking at a mitochondrial myopathy indication. So mitochondria have their own genome, right? And many of them sometimes, unfortunately, produce mutant genomes. So they have multiple copies in their genome. So our editor can go in there and cut out the mutant copies by targeting a certain mutation, while the wild type or the healthy genome continues to proliferate, and hence people's energy levels then come back through cellular respiration, et cetera. So that's kind of the two-prong there. So our goal is to advance those two programs as fast as possible, make sure we have enough money, make sure people understand the science, make sure patients are on board, doctors who are then eventually going to put this drug into clinical trials, making sure we're really building that capability. So those are some of the things I kind of deal with day to day. And every week can change, right? So like last week I was dealing with investors. This week I'm going to Philadelphia on Monday, and we'll be there dealing with the board, convincing them that this is the right strategy to keep things funding, et cetera, right? So things are always changing. So it's a great role because, as you can see, it's all about, for me, it's always been about breadth. And this is like the perfect role for breadth, right? It can be exhausting because you're doing so many different things, right? But it's a pretty exciting role so far for me. But this is something you do for like 2 years. And so now I'm kind of having those conversations. I'm going to the next role, which is here to the right. So I'll probably take over investor relations. Having access to money or capital is so important, right? Because as I mentioned, if we can't bring in money, everything shuts down, right? So my job will be to make sure everyone understands the excitement of the programs we're doing, when are these milestones going to come out, and why they should invest in our stock, right? Because we're a publicly traded company. And right now, if you guys are following the markets, it's an absolute bloodbath. There's no investments going into like high risk assets, and biotech is like one of the highest risk things you can do, right? People rather just put their money in the savings account and make 5-6%, rather than put it into a biotech company that may not have a product for another 6 to 10 years, right? So it's it's a really hard sell, if you will, right, to convince investors today. As long as interest rates are high, it's very, very difficult. All right, so I also wanted to try to convince some of you, right? I know you guys are all pre-health students, and like I did, you have tons of options available, right? Healthcare is such a big part of our economy, and there's so many cool different things you can do, right? As I mentioned, you can do policy, you can be a doctor, you can be a nurse, healthcare practitioner, you can go into insurance, right? You can do research, right? I mean, healthcare is never going anywhere. It's getting bigger and bigger part of the global economy. But one thing you could do is kind of take the path I took, is go into what people call industry, right? I'm going to talk about biotech or big pharma, and I think they each have their pros and cons, as I think I've alluded to. So the two biggest reasons I can think of is, right, first, you got to love technology. It's always evolving and changing. You're on the cutting edge and the front door of like even investing, making decisions. Why should we invest in this technology versus that? And that has huge repercussions, 10, 15 years from now, right? And so kind of really thinking about how can this be applied? What's the best use of the money that's very limited on what we should do? And how can this technology ultimately help people and move the company forward as a return, right? So that's also the first thing I think you really want to make sure resonates for you, right? And the second thing, I think many in healthcare are driven by this, right, is that you love making a direct impact on the lives of humans. And, whether it's lots of millions of patients, which kind of drives me, or even one-on-one, like rare diseases, right? Some of the programs we're looking at, there's only like 1,000, 2,000 patients in the US, which is not a big number compared to, let's say, hepatitis B with 300 million, right? So even rare diseases, I have friends who only will work in rare diseases because they like that individual impact of, you even sometimes get to see the patients that might use your product, right? Like through meetings and things like that, versus hepatitis B, you'll probably never meet anyone. So, I think having those two levers that you're passionate about, right? Technology and people, I think is why you would go into this industry, right? whether you have a PhD, an MD, an accountant. I mean, there's all types of roles at these companies. So you work with a very diverse group of people through different skill sets, right? But for example, like a small biotech like mine, I'd say 50% are PhDs, 10% are medical doctors or even practitioners. Even they got burnt out of practicing, and many then come into big pharma or biotech because they want more of a predictable schedule, right? I mean, we all know that doctors have to work on predictable hours, and there's a lot of pressures on that industry as well from just economics, et cetera. So sometimes doctors just get burnt out, and this is kind of a great exit path for many. So if you do go down the medical MD path, this is one way to kind of do something later on in your career and diversify. Or you can go right in, right, from a PhD or a master's. And from bachelor's, it's a little bit more difficult, but certainly doable. You just want to make sure you kind of focus on a certain subject area or a certain scientific base that lets you kind of get your first job as an analyst or a research associate or something like that. So these are all great things to consider. All right, so practical advice, right? So if you want to work in, I'm going to just talk about biotech because it's, I think, a little more cutting edge, right? Big pharma is a great first job because you get lots of time and space and investment into your development. So certainly do consider that. But I think the biggest thing in biotech is have a strong rationale and on your why, right? Because there's a lot of risk in biotech. Your company may not be even around in 3 years, right? As I mentioned, but you have to know your why. If it's something that, like for me, gene editing can cure patients, like I can finally say cure, right? To a select group of patients. To me, that's super motivating. So I always think, like, when I'm on my deathbed, what am I going to think about, right? When I look back, I'm going to think about my family first. I'm probably going to think about all the cool travel experiences. You don't usually think about all your jobs, right? And there's surveys where people have kind of done with people who are dying. They don't really ever think about their jobs or the manager that got them irritated, but they do think about the impact that they had on life, right? So you really want a job that hopefully aligns with your values and the impact you want to give. So for me, that ability to help other humans, right, I think is kind of like a really important rationale. Biotech makes the most sense because you're really hands-on helping to drive that enterprise forward. Once you know your why, I would say, really work on getting that first internship, even if it's unpaid. Just at first, you got to get the ball rolling. It's like a snowball effect, right? Once you start building momentum in your career, you become unstoppable that way, right? Because you become really rare and you're building momentum and people are excited, but you got to get that ball rolling. It's really slow in the beginning. It can be frustrating. It can be unpaid. It may not be glamorous. You may be doing paperwork. I mean, you just put your head down and think about that why and the big ultimate goal you have, right? Takes at least 10, 15 years to even get that ball at full speed, and then you're off to the races, right? Remember, we talked about, if you're working into your 60s, like you can sacrifice up to 30 just to get the ball going in the right direction, right? Then you have 30 years of extreme success that'll pay dividends, right? For all the early sacrifices you made. So start that process as early as you can. Talk to people. I think everyone's always willing to, give a 1-2 week experience or an internship, and even if it's a little unrelated to a biotech and, like, let's say a parallel industry, like working at a clinical research organization or a manufacturing organization that works with pharma companies, that's fine. I think just start getting your foot in the door little by little, right? And you can start this even in high school. There's tons of programs that help high school students out and local ones, right? And continue to, or even just go to the company and talk to HR and see if they'll. So there's always something that can be done. I'd say over time, right, start focusing on like a niche, right? Initially, you want to go as broad as possible, but eventually start thinking about, even as you're a student and thinking about where your story is going to be, right? Because you want to make sure you have a strong, compelling reason on why this person should get a job and not this person, right? Really start thinking about what you can say that's unique. So for me, it was all about, I'm going to be the best cancer drug launcher out there. Literally, that was kind of like my mission statement for myself. And here are all the things I'm going to do. And I kind of built that. And that became the positioning, if you will, in everyone's mind when they thought about my name, right? And you kind of get to know the same organization. So that was the initial position. Now I'm kind of taking a pivot. So I got to figure out what the next thing's going to be, right? Because I'm doing gene editing, not in oncology anymore. But that was kind of the original position that really helped me catapult my career early on. So even as you think about, even when you write your college essays or grad school essays, it's the same thing. You want to kind of have a simple message or a theme that really kind of sets you apart. And it's pithy and memorable, right? And then do everything you do, all your tactics in your career, you should it should always represent that thesis, if you will, right? Otherwise, you're kind of off strategy, and it doesn't help. So once you can define that niche for yourself, just own it, right? And just all you do, and you work on it, and you get deeper and deeper once you know what you want to do. Healthcare, right? In many ways, like if you think about technology, and I have friends who, like most people who are Google or Apple or wherever, it's very different. I mean, it's a very tech-enabled business. It's still a people business, but healthcare is like 10, 15 years behind, right? I mean, people are barely using anything that's available right now, like RFID. All of it is so far behind because it's a highly regulated industry that people don't change, right? Because there's too much of a cost if you fail in the risk to change. So it's all about people still, right? Like picking up the phone, talking, being approachable. There's also a lot of, typically more research, potentially introverted type of personalities, right? So it makes it easier just to stand out if you talk to people, ask questions, mentor people, mentee, give back, do things, right? Kind of make sure 30% of your time is hands-on people first. Like I don't even text anymore if I don't have to. I'll pick up the phone, do things differently, right? Because no one does that anymore, right? So you can kind of stand out just by being a better people person, right? So and it's not always comfortable. I don't always want to talk to people, but I'll force myself to do that because I know it's memorable when everyone else is doing something else, right? So people business, I don't think that's going to change for a very long time, right? Even at the implementation of healthcare is a one-on-one personal thing, right? So continue to embrace that. And then I would say finally, this industry does rapidly change, at least from a technology perspective, right? Technology creation. I know I was saying the implementation of technology within the company doesn't change, but what we do and create changes very rapidly. And even the regulations and how things are paid for, and there's a lot of noise and buzz that's always going on. So there's a lot of good resources that are free too, like Fierce, Biotech, Endpoints News, even Twitter, follow all there's like doctors who are celebrities that all they do is tweet about their subject. So if you find a area that's interesting to you, just start following them, right? And keeping up with the news. That'll certainly help with, interviews, talking to people, just being more interesting when you're even in a job. Even for a week, you can turn a lot of heads and say, this person knew about these issues that not a lot of people know about, right? So I think those were kind of my top 5 on, practical advice for pre-health students that kind of want to learn the industry. And so just to kind of conclude here, again, I kind of touched on gene editing. And so this is a slide I just stole from our research and development day, which is on our website for Precision if anyone wants to learn more, but really talking about what this next decade, right? So for me, working in cancer, many times people hear about it, like the innovation is incremental just because cancer is so difficult to mechanistically cure, but we do like one thing, right? Like this cancer is driven by, let's use breast cancer, by HER2, right? And so there's all these HER2 targeted agents. Once you target with HER2, yeah, you live 2-3 years longer, but the cancer gets smart and kind of evades it and goes around it, right? It's like water going around a roadblock. And so then we go with the second target, then the third target, but it's a very like unilateral way to think. And that's particularly because of the way our regulations are and the way we have to develop things. We test one hypothesis at a time, you reject it or accept it, right? It's just the way humans think. It's very like rational, linear, but it takes forever to drive major change, right? And cancer is the same thing. It takes like 50 years just to even add 10 years of life and the research and development. So for me, that became frustrating over time. So I'm like, there has to be a better way, which is you have to get to the root cause of the disease and literally cut the heart out of the disease, right? That's kind of what gene editing promises to do. And Jennifer Doudna and team won the Nobel Prize in 2012 in this. And Precision and other companies that are, exploring this are really in vivo gene editing. So the idea is you take a single shot, right? And you have a nuclease or a protein that goes, it has kind of like a honing device, if you will. It finds the mutation that your body has. Most of these things right now today are being investigated in the liver. There's all these diseases, 7 to 10,000 of them that are kind of in the eye muscle. You can see the schematic here that go beyond the liver. And the idea would be for in vivo gene editor to go into that tissue, right? You make it so it could selectively go after that tissue, find the mutation and cut out the disease. Or if it's a gain of function, you would cut it out and potentially insert the perfect copy of the gene, right? So there's all different cool things you can do, whether you're eliminating a disease or giving back someone a protein that's missing, like hemophilia, for example, right? They're missing the clotting factor. So you can actually insert the clotting factor into your liver cells, which then as the liver kind of self-replicates, right, it regenerates, all the cells then become permanently fixed. Eventually hemophilia goes away. So versus taking the hemophilia drug all the time and stopping your bleeds, right? So these are like practical ways to just really solve the disease through one shot, right? So again, we're all still just entering monkeys, if you will, right now, and now going into humans, right? First clinical studies into humans just started early last year. So you'll hear a lot about CRISPR, for example. That's one modality. What we do at Precision is called ARCUS. That's a different type of modality, but these are all gene editors at the end of the day that kind of promise the same thing. And everyone's going after different diseases and different tissues. There's lots of different reasons why. And if you're interested, you can go through our deck and I can walk you through it next time if you want. But this is really the future, right? It's just starting to come. And imagine if these things start working even on like 10% of the diseases, right? You're talking about 700 to 1,000 diseases that can be probably permanently cured, right? Well, you don't need medicines anymore. I mean, that's a huge impact to society, and really using all the scientific discoveries for the last, 20, 30, 40 years, even as we've kind of decoded the human genome, figured out how to now kind of manipulate it, how to deliver medicines, and everything we know. Unfortunately, I don't think it'll be cancer because it's not really monogenetic, right? There's so many mutations that are kind of driving cancer, as we talked about, but eventually we'll get there, right? But right now, I think there's so many diseases, especially that affect children, right? Because you're kind of born with these inherited disorders. So you really get an impact to affect the, children. The biggest beneficiaries will be the pediatric population, who are those who probably should suffer the least, right? Who are just starting their lives and make a huge impact in life. So I'm just really excited by this. So I hope to dedicate the rest of my career to this, right? I think that's kind of a good way to go out, if you will, and do something that's built on everything I've done, but really make a big difference. So yeah, I think that's all I have today, guys. So happy to take any questions you may have. Sorry if I ran a little over. Yeah, great question. So yeah, for sure. I think it goes back to volunteer. I remember, my parents were like, "You're going to be a doctor or whatever." I think I was in sixth grade or fifth grade, and I used to take the bus. My mom first, they dropped me off to go volunteer at the Robert Wood Johnson Hospital. It's in New Brunswick, New Jersey, and we lived like the next town over. First day she drops me off, I remember going there like, "Wow, God, I got to do this, right?" And get paid, nothing, like just kind of moaning about it. And they put me in patient transports, like literally when people get discharged, you kind of just push them in a wheelchair. And I kind of really started enjoying it because I just remember how like happy people were that A, you're connecting them to their family, right? Two, they're just happy to get out of the hospital. And three, they're grateful you're pushing them. So that was the first time as a kid, like someone actually cared that I was helping them, and I actually felt really good about it, right? And I think really doing that, and I got really excited. Day two, I remember taking the bus on my own and the bus back. And then it just became so exciting that summer. It was just literally just free volunteering at the hospital. And I think really being able to see the immediate gratification of just pushing someone elderly out or whoever, right? And kind of taking them to their solution, which was their family member, and discharging them. For me, that was really the moment. That feeling that I got was just kind of like addictive after a while, right? So I think that's definitely the moment that I felt myself change, right, as a kid to someone a little bit more mature. Yeah, I mean, of recency bias, but I guess let me just talk about the recent tough decision. So, our company, as I mentioned, it's like really tough right now to raise capital, right? It's been going on for about 18 months. They call it like the biotech nuclear winter, if you will, that keeps going. So we were unfortunately forced to sell half our business, right? That's just happened. We had this whole oncology, cancer, CAR T cell therapy business, right? But remember, I'm a cancer guy. So that's one of the reasons I even came to Precision before I discovered gene editing. And same with my boss, et cetera. But we really had to figure out either we had to sell this piece of the business or lay people off, right? Because we just couldn't afford to do two things at once. There just wasn't enough cash in the bank to see it through. Everything would end up failing at that point. So you have to make a trade-off. Like, do you live to see your best card in your hand, right? And unfortunately, some people lose their job, or you have to try to work your best to save the job. I mean, we worked our tails off this summer to really get a deal. We finally found an Australian company that took our CAR T business. So we were able to save, I think, like 55 of the 80 jobs. But the hardest thing was like, obviously, the other 25, right? And you're changing people's lives, unfortunately. And people get severance, you make sure they're taken care of, but it's just a really hard thing to do, right? So I think that's been the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with, is kind of being someone in the driver's seat of deciding that a split or a transition needs to happen, and selling off a part of your company, because these are your friends and people you spend time with, but ultimately it just comes down to what you're working on. And if that's not longer needed, you kind of have to do what's best for the enterprise. And it's not about the people, right? But people are affected by it. That's the problem. So taking something so objective and trying to keep it objective, I mean, it definitely, it tears you up. It's tough, right? I think you have to, so, hopefully I never have to go through that again, but that was definitely the most challenging thing. And I'm sure there's other examples, but that's a real recent experience from within 2 months. And thanks for so many different leadership styles. Like, my boss is very direct, CEO from New York, like very opposite style of me, right? I like to informally lead, and you almost lead from behind, right? Versus always leading from the front. I think you have to be able to mold your style. So I'd say, I'm able to kind of do both. Luckily, I kind of figured that out earlier in my career. But I prefer to kind of inspire, set a vision, and let people kind of drive themselves towards there while I roll up my sleeves and set an example, right? I think that's kind of the best way to get mass amount of people inspired to really build a major change, right? You can certainly be directive, top down, and push people, and use fear tactics, etc. There's a lot of CEOs who kind of do that, right? And that I've seen even people do. But what I've seen the best executives kind of set the vision, roll up their sleeves, emulate the behavior they want others to have, right? And kind of let them figure out their why and get there. So you kind of need people to have the same why and incentives as you. And, you make sure people are taken care of, compensated, all of that. All those things are kind of like table stakes, but I think you have to kind of lead that way. At least I think that's kind of the right way to lead for my personal style. But yeah. Great question. At a biotech company where you sometimes only have one drug you're working on, the whole company's existence is that product, right? You'll see a lot of that. It's demoralizing. I mean, companies fall apart, half the company gets restructured, and it's heartbreaking. And sometimes you don't recover from it, quite frankly, right? I think that's kind of tough. When you're at a little, say a medium or a bigger company where you have multiple products, right? I think usually you can kind of deflect and move people onto other projects and keep. The best way to move on is you give like everyone a day to mourn, and then the best way is just move on, action, right? That's usually, even when there's decisions, you have to make them swift, right? You don't let them linger on. You make quick actions and then you move on, right? People want to do work and do good quality work. So I think as long as you let people toil, like people forget the pain, if you will, right? But yeah, it's certainly a reality, right? And if you have a single asset company, it's brutal. I mean, it's just, that's why it takes a certain type of person, I think, that wants to, who likes risk too, right? And they're okay with failure, and then you kind of get back up. But it's not as risky as being a true, like, let's say, startup entrepreneur, but there are elements of that, right? And yeah, remember, 90% of drugs fail. So you're going to fail 9 out of 10 times. You have to be okay with that, right?